Good evening. I'm Jabari Morris, and this is MMT Mondays. Tonight, we tackle the idea of the national debt and the debt clock and show how silly they are. Politicians, economists, business leaders like to say that the national debt is a burden to future generations. This simply is not true. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons below, and let's get to it. In this first clip, John Oliver sets the scene of the insanity of the debt clock.
The story tonight concerns the national debt, the world's most boring $28 trillion. It's an absolute fuck ton of money, but regardless, the national debt is a complete obsession in this country. Here in New York, we even have a debt clock that counts up in real time. It actually made headlines a little over a decade ago when the debt hit 14 digits.
The national debt just passed $10 trillion, so the clock's caretakers had to squeeze a 1 and the dollar sign into the same square.
It's pretty scary. It's a pretty big number.
Incomprehensible. It's too big.
The clock was put up in 1989 by Helena Durst's grandfather, when the national debt was just under $3 trillion. Now that the debt has passed the $10 trillion mark, Durst likes to recite a poem by her grandfather.
Borrow, borrow, borrow. Enjoy today and tomorrow, for tomorrow's going to be terrible.
I'm sorry, but that poem sucks. The rhyme scheme's all over the place, and if tomorrow is going to be terrible, why would you enjoy it? That was clearly the work of a man almost as good at writing poetry as he was at raising children who aren't serial killers. Oh yeah, the clock was put up by that Durst family, the bathroom murder burp Dursts. So thanks very much for the dumb clock that doesn't tell time, you wealthy bathroom murder burpers. But the truth is, our national debt is undeniably big. And between the trillions in coronavirus stimulus bills and the infrastructure plans Biden unveiled just this week, it's poised to get even bigger. And Republicans in particular seem outraged by that.
This chart showing debt is not just about the big number. It's not just about the $30 trillion of debt. This is about tyranny.
History is screaming this warning at us. Countries that bankrupt themselves and destroy their economies simply aren't around very long.
There will be a day of reckoning, a debt crisis, and it won't be pretty.
He then explains that most of the national debt is actually owed to American investors.
That Pledge of Allegiance ad talked about how much we owe the Chinese government. That is something you hear a lot. But for the record, the majority of government debt is actually owned by American investors. For example, if you have a pension, you might own some of that debt in the form of government bonds because they're a pretty safe investment. Foreign investors only own around a third of our debt. And while yes, it is true, China does own over $1 trillion of it, which isn't nothing, it's around 5%. For what it's worth, they're not even our largest foreign creditor, Japan is. And while the debt is often talked about as being something that we're running up with new spending, the truth is, before the pandemic hit, most of our debt was the result of long, steady growth in programs that we'd long ago committed to, like Medicare and other entitlements. So we are very much getting stuff for the money that we're spending. And that actually brings us to a really important point here. Going into debt can actually be a good investment for the country. Essentially, as economists will tell you, the key question is, are you spending money on the right things?
Mike Norman, chief economist of John Thomas Financial, dispels the idea that the national debt can lead to default.
With a 9% unemployment rate and millions of people out of work and industrial capacity far below what our potential is and millions of unsold homes and all this other excess capacity that we have, what we should be doing is increasing demand, and the way that we do that in an economy where most people are trying to cut back their debt is for the government to step in and stimulate demand by spending on infrastructure, on education, on healthcare, on basic research and development, on transportation, on alternative energy. These are the things we did in the past. These are the things that created the real capital that was passed along from generation to generation. It's what made this country rich, and it's exactly the thing we're not doing now because we've become sidetracked on this nonsensical issue of the government of the United States running out of money when it is an impossibility.
J.D. Alt gives us a better idea of what the national debt is in this quote from his article in 2018. What is unique about U.S. government borrowing and what gives this term applied in that context is confusion and ambiguity is the fact that the promise, which replaces a borrowed dollar, is simply another kind of dollar. Specifically, the government borrows a dollar from the economy and replaces it with a treasury bond or note, which is, in effect, a special form of dollars that earn interest. The treasury bond or note has the same liquidity, tradability in the economy as the regular dollars it has replaced. Therefore, the amount of money in the private sector doesn't fall by the amount taken out by the borrowing, but remains the same as before the borrowing occurred. If you still aren't sure you understand the national debt, here's Stephanie Kelton herself explaining it.
If the government is spending on things like infrastructure and education and R&D, research and development, these are the kinds of things that increase productivity and increase the economy's potential output so that you actually end up with a bigger bucket over time.
So now that we know that a deficit isn't necessarily a bad thing, and the US government can always make money, it's time to answer that earlier question. Why is there a national debt? The truth is, there isn't. As Professor Kelton explains, what we call the national debt is just the total account of all the money the government has spent over the years minus all the money the government has taxed back. Even if the government has spent more than it's collected, it doesn't have to pay anyone back for the difference. But what about when people say things like, the US owes China? Well, investors, including foreign governments, buy bonds issued by the US Treasury. The return on these investments is virtually guaranteed because the US can always create the money to pay. So there's no danger of a foreign army showing up to repossess the White House. Understanding that the US government can never run out of money and can continue deficit spending as long as inflation is kept under control means big policy ideas like universal healthcare, a Green New Deal, or student debt forgiveness might pay for themselves by keeping more money in the hands of consumers, employing more workers, and expanding the country's infrastructure. That's what happened after World War II when huge government investment led to the expansion of the middle class. But for decades now, people have been told a different story.
If the state wishes to spend more, it can do so only by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more. And it's no good thinking that someone else will pay. That someone else is you. There is no such thing as public money. There is only taxpayers' money.
Now, like the US, Britain also issues its own sovereign currency. So, Margaret Thatcher had it wrong. When the government wants to spend, that money is made instantly. It doesn't wait for taxes. We saw that recently when the US Congress wrote trillions of dollars into existence by passing major COVID relief bills without raising taxes.
You can now clearly see that the national debt is nothing more than the total sum of US Treasuries outstanding. This isn't something your kids have to pay back. In fact, there are no more than savings accounts at the Federal Reserve. If you enjoyed tonight's video, make sure to check us out at realprogressives.org and subscribe to get notifications on new video streams in YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, Facebook, and Rockfin. Thank you and continue learning.